Now, the third person in row would be Dara E Seidl. And let me introduce Dara. She's a geographic information scientist and geoprivacy researcher. Her work focuses on development on geomasking techniques and on measuring the privacy desires of public citizens. In particular, Dara studies attempt by everyday individuals to protect their own local privacy. Dr. Seidl is a recent graduate of the joint doctoral program in geography between San Diego State University and University of California at Santa Barbara. So please, Dara.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. And thank you very much to the rest. Oh.
That.
This one.
Need both.
Oh.
Because
Excellent.
Yeah, so Ronald can follow
Great.
you.
Well, thanks again, and thank you to the organizing committee. It's a pleasure to be here today and share with you some of my recent research on location privacy. So I focus specifically on location privacy or geoprivacy, which geographers refer to as the right of the individual to determine when and how their personal location data are shared with others. And so, could I borrow? And so when I was preparing for this talk, I tried to think about what aspects of my research would most apply to official statistics and informing your discussion on the application of big data in creating official statistics. And before I started my PhD, I worked for 7 years at a consulting firm that conducted travel behavior surveys. And I see the development of technology in travel behavior surveys as paralleling the work that you do in official statistics. So there was a great change in technology over time, just in the last 10 years, where travel behavior surveys moved from traditional pen and paper methods to GPS data to finally cell tower data. And I'll be reviewing different aspects of this work today. So overall, I'll talk first about the promise of mobility data for official statistics, its use in traditional travel behavior surveys, some applications specifically for household travel surveys with regard to machine learning algorithms and artificial intelligence. I'll touch on some work in geomasking techniques to balance between protecting privacy and spatial information preservation in GPS data. I'll talk briefly about cell tower mobility data as travel behavior surveys move towards this kind of data. And finally, I'll talk about recent research I've conducted on personal level obfuscation, so the attempts that individuals make to protect their own location privacy. So that sounds like a whole lot of disparate topics, but I'll try to tie them all together under the common theme of travel behavior survey developments. So 10 years ago, travel behavior surveys were conducted with paper diaries. The purpose of these surveys was to inform travel models. So participants in these surveys would write down their origins and destinations for each of their routine trips during the day. Around 2010, the industry, at least in the United States, started to move towards deploying GPS data loggers to replace paper diaries. So these GPS data loggers would collect every second of GPS data and were accurate up to 3 meters. So this was a great change in the resolution and the frequency of mobility data available. In one way, this can be considered big data because of its volume, but again, this is using traditional sampling methods to gain survey results. So it's not the same real-time cell tower data that, or close to real-time data. There's still a sampling plan involved in this kind of data collection. However, the precision of the data collection has great utility for travel demand models and helping to pinpoint which roads, which bridges are becoming the most used. There are many challenges for the analyst in tackling this kind of high volume data. So in the picture on the left, you can see an example of raw GPS data collected every second. And there are a lot of challenges in extracting useful information from these data. How do you determine what is an origin or a destination in a trip? How do you account for short trips, such as when somebody stops at a gas station versus a long traffic light? There are issues with positional accuracy in GPS data. Are there urban canyons or natural canyons or canopy cover impacting how well you can pick up a GPS signal? And finally, the sampling frequency. There are likely to be jumps in the data. So while the loggers can collect every second of data, they may skip minutes, hours. How does an algorithm, a machine learning algorithm, or an algorithm that an analyst designs, how do these account for these kinds of challenges in mobility data, and how do we extract useful information? These continue to be challenges. And of course, until such algorithms are perfected, there are always risks of disclosure, particularly when you have analysts conducting manual review on these kinds of mobility data. And Dr. Letouze yesterday talked a little bit about the sensitivity of mobility data compared to discrete location data. Discrete location data being perhaps a household, a single point in time. Mobility data, we have multiple points in time forming a trajectory. And Dr. Letouze referenced the 2013 de Montjoie study, which found that only 4 location points or call records over time can uniquely identify 95% of individuals. So location data is extremely high in identifying power. Enter geomasking. There's a lot of interest among geographers for geomasking techniques, which by definition alter point data to protect privacy while also preserving spatial information. So the typical use case for a geomasking technique, also known as obfuscation, is a researcher or a statistics office wishes to release a spatial data set, a georeference data set to the public. How can it be released while protecting location privacy? One of the studies I did a few years ago was applying geomasking techniques to travel behavior surveys. Earlier today, we talked about secure data enclaves for accessing data, and this is just how I access travel behavior survey data for 2 major metropolitan regions, Chicago and Atlanta in the United States. So this was a virtual data enclave, and after a very long application process, I was able to access the very high resolution second-by-second GPS travel data. So I applied 2 geomasking techniques to these data, which I'll explain very briefly. They are very simple in concept, and I don't want to give the impression that these are the most effective techniques. These are just some of the most basic and widely used. The first technique is grid masking. This is when you overlay a grid of a specified cell size, one that you specify, with your point data, and then each point is snapped to the closest vertex of its corresponding grid cell. So the resulting image looks a lot like the one on the top right, which is a gridded appearance. More widely used, especially in public-facing maps that are geomasked, is the concept of random perturbation. And we talked a little bit earlier about perturbation in databases. The perturbation with spatial data is quite similar. The concept is you move each point a random distance in a random direction within an outer distance threshold. When you're evaluating a geomasking technique, there are 2 main quantities to measure. First is how well it preserves the spatial information. The second is how well the technique preserves the privacy of individuals. there are many ways to capture how well spatial information is preserved, and these are definitely less contentious than how we measure the privacy of a geomasking technique. So a lot of the research in geography is focused on the concept of spatial k-anonymity, so ensuring that your masked point data is indistinguishable from k others in the data set. So basically, if your masked point has a minimum threshold of neighbors that it could be possibly mistaken for. For trajectory data, you're looking at how much of each trajectory is shared with other trajectories. Overall, geomasking results are difficult to assign a standard for because each study area is different. So the results in this study area, which found that the better balance was met between 30 and 100 meters of geomasking outer distance threshold. This doesn't necessarily apply to other study areas. Statisticians and geographers would have to do their own research there because these are urban areas, and when you try to apply them to more rural areas, it becomes more challenging because points are moved farther away. Another issue for accuracy and big data that I wanted to bring up is that of using machine learning. And I bring this back to the example of travel behavior data. And one of the common questions that we ask of GPS data collected in travel surveys is how can we assign travel mode? How can we figure out automatically what is car travel, what is bus travel, what is metro, what is walking, what is bicycle? So some researchers, including myself, have applied very basic machine learning methods such as the random forest classification to try and assign travel mode automatically to GPS data. And the point I want to make here is that any machine learning algorithm is dependent on the data that are coming in. So if you have biased data coming in, the bias is going to present itself in your results. So in this example, you can see that very few bus trips are represented in this data set. And this translates itself into a very poor segment prediction success for the bus travel mode and the auto travel mode in GPS travel data. So we only have about a 50% success rate in predicting bus travel. Of course, with real-time mobility data collection, your machine learning algorithm is constantly fed, but you just have to make sure, and we as researchers have to make sure, that we are conducting bias reviews of the input data for such models. Okay, we've talked about travel diaries for travel behavior surveys. We've talked about the move to deploying GPS data loggers to collect mobility data. The trend after that, probably starting a few years ago, was to move to companies, to hiring companies that receive cell signal data. So one of the main companies in the United States that does this is called AirSage, and they receive all the call records from Sprint and Verizon phones. So they sell this data to municipal governments who are conducting travel surveys to augment and replace the traditional methods that have been sampled. So there are many considerations when it comes to cell signal data. One is that GPS was great because it was very high resolution. The resolution of the data from cell towers is much coarser. However, obtaining this kind of data is more dynamic to rapid changes. Still, there is the question that there are variations in phone activity, phone use, and so this is another consideration that could lead to bias in analyzing these kinds of data. So I want to turn now to a more human element that may lead to bias in in using big data for official statistics. And this is the prevalence of location masking behavior. So these are efforts by individuals to protect their own location privacy. Examples of this include turning off location services on your cell phone, providing incorrect address information to retailers, providing incorrect address information in a survey, using technology to alter your IP address. And I received a National Science Foundation grant in the United States to conduct a survey in California on this very topic, to assess the prevalence of individual-level location masking. So in my survey, I had 214 participants. I had 2 samples. One was an address-based postal sample, where participants received mail letters. The other was an online open sample, where I placed Facebook advertisements. The 2 samples differed in several key demographic variables. The online open sample was significantly more female, lower income, and younger than the address-based postal sample. This survey was designed to avoid the major dichotomy that you encounter in privacy research, in human-based privacy research, which is that participants far and wide report high concern for privacy, but their behavior does not match their level of concern. And so the purpose of this study was to ensure that the survey did not use the word privacy, that participants knew that they were taking part in a study that was related to online information sharing, but there were no red flags that would cause respondent bias to make them inflate their privacy concerns. So the very first question in the survey was to have participants enter their home location in a text field and then move a point on the map, either to correct their home location or to mask their home location, to move it away from their actual location. So there were 2 variables I was looking for here. The first was the precision of location that respondents provided. Did they provide a street address? Did they just provide a zip code? And finally, how truthful was their input? Now, there was no ground truth for this study. I did not collect people's IP addresses and then reverse geocode that. I instead asked respondents how truthful they were about reporting this kind of information. And the results were rather interesting. Far and away, there is evidence for personal level location masking. Even though the 2 samples differed demographically, 15% of respondents reported providing incorrect home location information in the text boxes, and then 10% responded that they moved the point on the map away from their home location. So that's very fascinating. It gives us some measure of what is incorrect in when we receive location data. Other location masking techniques were that about 25% of the respondents reported always or often keeping location services off. And particularly in the online sample, about 25% of respondents reported using technology to alter IP address. This survey collected a lot more variables such as knowledge and attitudes related to geoprivacy. And both of these played a part in predicting some location masking behavior. So I'll give the example that for predicting use of technology to alter IP address, significant predictors of this are knowledge that it is possible for IP address to reveal location, and the belief that websites do not do a good job of protecting personal data. So this paper is forthcoming. So I want to wrap up and tie all those disparate parts of the presentation together. So first of all, the common thread is mobility data for travel behavior surveys and moving towards mobility data for capturing official statistics. This is a field that is changing rapidly. And geomasking research is is young. It has a ways to go in measuring privacy, particularly with the threat of auxiliary spatial databases that exist. I should mention that there are all kinds of freely available websites in the US that provide points on a map, such as one called superdataprofiles.com, where you can look up a name and it has the person's age, ethnicity, and estimated income or net worth. And most of the data is incorrect in some places, but yet these kinds of high-resolution spatial data exist and could provide a link to the kinds of sensitive data that we're trying to protect. Accurate processing and analysis of mobility data definitely remains a challenge. This is not just for GPS data, this is also for cell tower data. And I hope I brought attention to bias that could occur with the additional challenge we have now that there are measures of location masking behavior at the individual level. So thank you.
Thank you very